HOA tried evicting me over my driveway, unaware my dad runs their construction firm. My wife and I bought our house in Maple Ridge Estates about 2 years ago. It's a beautiful neighborhood with well-maintained homes, tree-lined streets, and friendly neighbors. Well, mostly friendly. The houses were all built by my dad's construction company, though most people don't know that since I don't advertise being the CEO's son. I wanted to make it on my own merits. Everything was great for the first year and a half. We followed all the HOA rules, paid our dues on time, and kept our property in perfect condition. The trouble started when I decided to repave our driveway this spring. The original concrete was starting to crack, and I wanted to try something different, a modern permeable paver system that's better for the environment and helps with drainage. I did everything by the book. Submitted the plans to the HOA Architectural Committee, included detailed specifications, and even provided examples of similar driveways in other upscale neighborhoods. The committee initially approved it, so I hired a contractor and got the work done. The new driveway looked fantastic. Several neighbors even came by to compliment it and ask about possibly doing the same to theirs. But then came the first letter from the HOA board. Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your recently installed driveway does not conform to neighborhood aesthetic standards. Please restore the driveway to its original condition within 30 days, or face fines of $100 per day. I was confused. The architectural committee had approved the plans. I called the HOA office immediately. Hi, this is OP from 1242 Maple Drive. I just received a violation notice about my driveway, but it was approved by the architectural committee last month. One moment, the secretary said. After a long pause, she came back. The board has overruled that approval. The new board president feels the pavers don't match the neighborhood aesthetic. New board president? I asked. When did this change? Mrs. Anderson took over last week when the previous president resigned unexpectedly. Ah, that explained it. Mrs. Anderson had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and immediately started trying to impose her vision of how things should be. She'd already gotten into arguments with several neighbors about their landscaping choices. I decided to attend the next board meeting to sort this out in person. Big mistake. Mrs. Anderson, a woman in her 50s with an obvious superiority complex, sat at the center of the board table like she was holding court. When I tried to explain about the prior approval, she cut me off. That approval was clearly a mistake, she said dismissively. The architectural guidelines specifically state that all driveways must be consistent with the original construction materials. Your creative interpretation is unacceptable. But the permeable pavers actually improve property values, I argued. They're considered an upgrade in most neighborhoods. Perhaps in other neighborhoods, she sneered, but not in Maple Ridge Estates. We have standards to maintain. Then came the bomb. Furthermore, she continued, your continued defiance of HOA authority shows a complete disregard for our community. If you don't restore the driveway to its original condition within 30 days, we'll begin eviction proceedings. The room went silent. Even the other board members looked uncomfortable. You can't evict someone over a driveway, I said incredulously. Mrs. Anderson smiled coldly. Actually, we can. The HOA bylaws give us the authority to enforce compliance through all legal means necessary, including forced sale of the property. Perhaps you should have read them more carefully. I left that meeting seething, but also trying not to laugh. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Time to make some calls. First, I phoned my dad. Hey Dad, remember how you built all the houses in Maple Ridge Estates? Of course, one of our biggest projects 5 years ago. Why? I explained the situation. There was a long pause, then he burst out laughing. Son, I think it's time for some quality control inspections. We guarantee our work for 10 years, you know. The next day, teams of inspectors from my dad's company showed up throughout the neighborhood. They paid particular attention to the board members' houses, meticulously documenting every tiny flaw or potential code violation. Mrs. Anderson came storming over while they were checking her house. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. The lead inspector looked up from his tablet. "Standard quality control inspection, ma'am. We guarantee our work for 10 years, and we take that very seriously." "I didn't authorize this inspection." "You didn't need to, ma'am. It's in your purchase contract." He showed her the relevant clause. "We can inspect any time we want to ensure our construction meets standards." She stormed off to call her lawyer. Meanwhile, the inspections continued. By the end of the week, we had quite a collection of interesting findings. I waited until the next HOA meeting to spring the trap. Mrs. Anderson was in full swing, reading out a list of violations she'd documented around the neighborhood. "And finally," she said, glaring at me, "H.O.A.'s still not complied with the order to restore his driveway. I move that we begin eviction proceedings immediately." "Before we vote on that," I said, standing up, "I have some interesting information to share." I pulled out a thick folder and began reading. 1472, Oak Lane, home of Mrs. Anderson, unauthorized structural modifications to load-bearing walls, non-compliant electrical work, improper ventilation in the attic addition. All modifications done without proper permits or inspections. Her face went pale. "How dare you?" 2244 Maple Drive, home of board member Stevens, unpermitted basement finishing, non-compliant plumbing installation, possible mold issues due to improper waterproofing. The other board members started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Would you like me to continue? I have similar reports for every board member's house. All of these violations were documented by certified inspectors from the original construction company, which, by the way, is run by my father. You could have heard a pin drop in that room." "Now," I continued, "we could report all these violations to the city building department. They'd probably condemn some of these houses until the issues are fixed." Or what?" Mrs. Anderson asked weakly. "Or we could agree that my driveway isn't really hurting anyone, and maybe the board could focus on actual problems, instead of harassing residents over aesthetic choices that were already approved." The vote to rescind the violation notice against my driveway was unanimous. Mrs. Anderson resigned from the board the next day, citing personal reasons. But I wasn't done yet. After consulting with my dad, we decided to offer a neighborhood-wide deal. We would help any resident upgrade to permeable paver driveways at cost, no markup. It would be good advertising for both the pavers and my dad's company. Within 6 months, half the neighborhood had converted their driveways. Property values actually went up due to the environmental benefits and modern aesthetic. Mrs. Anderson put her house up for sale shortly after, unable to face the constant reminder of her defeat every time she drove through the neighborhood. The new HOA board is much more reasonable. They even added permeable pavers as a pre-approved option in the architectural guidelines. Sometimes my neighbors joke about my rebellious driveway that started a neighborhood revolution. As for me, I'm just glad I could teach them a lesson about picking their battles more carefully. And my dad? He likes to remind me that sometimes it pays to advertise who you know after all. The HOA still exists, but they've learned to think twice before trying to bully residents. Amazing what a little karma can do. Edit. Wow, this blew up. Thanks for all the comments and support. A lot of people asked for more details about what happened after, so here's the full update on everything that went down. Update. It's been 6 months since my last post, and boy, do I have some stories to tell you. Remember how I mentioned Mrs. Anderson put her house up for sale? Well, that's just the beginning of what happened after she tried to evict me over my driveway. First, let me tell you about the house sale situation. Mrs. Anderson tried to list her house for way above market value, claiming all the premium upgrades she'd done justified the price. You know, the same unpermitted modifications our inspection revealed? Yeah, those ones. Her real estate agent quit after the first week, when Mrs. Anderson refused to disclose the known issues with the house. She tried selling it herself after that, but that backfired spectacularly when potential buyers started asking for inspection reports. One couple actually contacted my dad's company directly to ask about the house's history, since they knew we were the original builders. Dad's office had to legally disclose the documented issues. The couple backed out immediately and apparently spread the word in their real estate agent's circle about the problems. Mrs. Anderson then tried to blame me and my dad's company for sabotaging her sale. She actually filed a lawsuit claiming we were interfering with her business dealings. Her lawyer dropped her case after learning about all the unauthorized modifications she'd made. The cherry on top? The lawyer contacted the city building department about the violations, since he was now legally obligated to report them. The city inspector's visit was epic. They found even more issues than our initial inspection. Mrs. Anderson was hit with multiple code violations and given 60 days to either bring everything up to code or restore the house to its original condition. The fine started at $500 per day after that deadline. Remember those other board members whose houses also had issues? They scrambled to fix their violations before the city found out. My dad's company offered to do the work at cost. We're not completely heartless, but only if they signed agreements to step down from the board and never serve on it again. They all agreed pretty quickly. The really interesting part came when we started the driveway conversion program. Once people saw how good the permeable pavers looked and learned about the environmental benefits, it sparked a whole neighborhood improvement movement. The new HOA board, made up of much more reasonable people, worked with my dad's company to create a comprehensive property enhancement program. We discovered that Mrs. Anderson had actually been taking kickbacks from certain contractors while on the board, steering HOA maintenance contracts their way in exchange for cash under the table. One of those contractors got caught up in an unrelated fraud investigation and spilled everything to reduce his own charges. The HOA's insurance company launched an audit and found years of financial mismanagement. Turns out Mrs. Anderson wasn't the first board member to abuse their position. She was just the most obvious about it. The insurance company ended up suing several former board members to recover misappropriated funds. Here's where it gets really good. The city's planning department got interested in our permeable paver program. They're now using our neighborhood as a case study for sustainable development. They're even offering tax incentives for other neighborhoods that implement similar drainage solutions. My dad's company has gotten so many requests for these driveways that we had to create a whole new division just to handle the demand. He jokes that my rebellious driveway turned into one of his best marketing campaigns ever. As for Mrs. Anderson, she couldn't afford to fix all the code violations, and the daily fines were piling up. She ended up having to sell her house at a massive loss to an investor who specializes in renovating problematic properties. I heard she moved in with her sister in Florida. The investor who bought her house? They're working with my dad's company to completely renovate it, bringing everything up to code and adding all the premium features Mrs. Anderson had tried to fake, including a proper permeable paver driveway. The new HOA board has completely revamped how things work here. They created an online portal where all financial records and board decisions are transparent to residents. Architectural guidelines were updated to encourage environmental improvements while maintaining property values. They even started a community advisory committee to get input from residents before making major decisions. My wife thinks it's hilarious that my simple driveway project ended up revolutionizing the whole neighborhood. She likes to remind me that sometimes standing up to bullies doesn't just help you, it can end up helping everyone. The best part? Every time I pull into my driveway, I smile thinking about how Mrs. Anderson's attempt to exert power over my property ended up costing her everything. Sometimes karma works in beautifully ironic ways. Last week we had a neighborhood block party, another new tradition started by the new board. Several residents came up to thank me for standing up to the old board. One elderly neighbor actually hugged me, saying she'd been afraid to speak up about board harassment for years. My dad stopped by the party and got a kick out of everyone calling him the Driveway King. He's thinking about making that the official slogan for the new division. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning. It's watching your victory create positive change for everyone else too. Oh, and remember those other neighborhoods where Mrs. Anderson said permeable pavers would never be accepted? 3 of them have now contacted my dad's company about starting their own conversion programs. I guess good ideas speak for themselves, no matter what entitled HOA presidents might think. As for me, I'm just enjoying my beautiful driveway and the peaceful, friendly neighborhood we have now. Amazing how removing a few bad apples can help an entire community blossom. Final edit. Thanks for all the messages asking about the permeable paver program. No, I can't give out my dad's company info, Reddit rules, but I encourage everyone to look into these types of improvements for their own properties. Just make sure to check your HOA guidelines first, and maybe confirm your board members don't have any unpermitted modifications before they try to give you grief about yours. The next one is titled, Professor Demands We Stick to Schedule. We stick to schedule. This was last year. In hindsight, I feel a little bad for the professor. He wasn't the worst I'd ever had, and he was up against a university which was in turmoil behind the scenes and spearheading an untested new course. That being said, I am paying quite exorbitantly for this education, and he was a right snot about this, so, It was a history course, and one of the assignments was a group project wherein we presented in front of the class. There was a 3-hour seminar taking place in a lecture hall, the last hour of which was reserved for 2 groups to go up and present at a half-hour apiece. This would involve a queue and a session afterwards, just to keep us on our toes, I suppose. Professor really emphasized that we pick the week and topic we're going to present in, and that's that. It's first come first serve, and if you miss your spot you get a 0. Thought nothing of it at the time, seemed fair. Didn't like his attitude, but whatever, right? Well, I won the lottery with the group I was assigned. They were grand lads and a dream to work with. We decided on an advantageous week to present, given our schedules, and we spent the run-up fine-tuning this presentation and really getting it to work. We used a stopwatch and everything. We even brought in outsiders to ask questions we might not predict. All was well. Except we were presenting in week 5, and a disturbing pattern had emerged during the seminars in weeks 2, 3, and 4. For all his talk about keeping things constrained and everyone working within a schedule, whoever went second was screwed. The first group always ran long, and the second group had to make do with, at most, 20 minutes. You could see the stress on their faces. So come week 5, the rest of my group, a little bit more nervous than I am, worries aloud about whether all of our careful planning will be for pot. I decide to throw a Hail Mary, thinking that the worst I could get is a no, right? So I go up right before class starts and ask the professor what are the odds we might go on first out of the 2. After all, we're sure we have this down to 30 minutes. The dude proceeds to rake me across the coals in front of everyone. It was a normal speaking voice, but the podium was right by the door, and people were filing in. Tells me not to ask such a stupid question and to go back to my seat. I go back, tail between my legs, pissed off, and sit with steam shooting out of my ears for the next 2 hours. Sure enough, the other group goes first. And sure enough, they run long. We shoot concerned looks to the professor, who is too busy watching the other group to notice. Come 50 minutes in, and the first group is just about wrapping up. The guys in my group are silently freaking out about this. Nightmare, right? That's when the professor stands up, polite applause all around, and then says, "Well, I guess we're finishing early today, huh?" Like a scene out of a courtroom drama, the 4 of us stand up like a shot and ask what the hell is going on. He can't quite hear us from back, and we're all talking at once, so he asks, "What's going on?" I charge down those steps like King Kong. In the same tone of voice, in front of the same door that people were now filing out of, I tell this guy that we're booked for the assignment today and we have something prepared. What? Turns out he totally plumb forgot that we were presenting today, and that's why he was so mad at my suggestion earlier. So I tell him we're presenting now to an empty room, or he's giving us 100. The poor guy sure did try. Insisted we hadn't signed up this week. We had. Insisted that he could schedule us in next week, even assuming 2 of 4 of our group weren't away on placement for their teaching degree. We booked for this week as ordered. Insisted that he had somewhere to be. Not my problem, mate. Dude just had to wear it. After making a phone call to, presumably his next appointment, he had to stand there, white as a sheet, and wear it. I'll never forget the look on his face. So we presented to a lecture hall empty of all but the professor and 2 students who, I guess, wanted to see more of the show. We got a great grade to boot.